And I graduated from the top of my class at Harvard. I've been through Yale Law School. I'm working at a hedge fund in New York. Like, let's just get real here. Like, I know you. We haven't met before, but I know you. You're not unfamiliar to me. And what I see amongst even my peers is a form of laziness. I'm saying this out of respect and not an attack, in a constructive way. I saw a little bit of it in the start of this conversation.
In this video, we are going to watch Vivek Ramaswamy's recent appearance on leftist commentator David Pakman's show. This is an interesting one, and they talk about some fascinating topics. But the best part is most definitely at the end, when Vivek calls out and educates this man in the most classy yet direct way. It actually blew me away. So pay very close attention to the line of questioning at the start, and then the way that Vivek circles back to that at the end and how he does it. Let's get into it.
I'm going to get right into what, fortunately or unfortunately, is often my first question when we speak to candidates right now. It's just sort of like a sanity check, which I think you will pass, honestly.
Let's hope.
Is there any way to interpret that Donald Trump actually won the 2020 election, or did he lose the 2020 election?
The way you're framing the question, you're asking me a very specific question. Is there any way? Here's one important unexplored strand. Okay. The Hunter Biden laptop story and its systematic suppression. I'm a data-driven guy.
Really?
I'm a data-driven guy, and I think you probably are too, based on
absolutely
what little I know. So look at the polling data on the aftermath and before and after. There are more than enough people, it's not even by a super small margin, that say they would have changed their vote had they been exposed to that information before that election. The fact is that was systematically suppressed in what was probably the single greatest form of election interference in American history.
And
there was a lot of discussion.
Words,
if I may just finish, just so you get the full freight of my view here.
Yeah.
There was a lot of discussion about the legitimacy of the 2016 election on the back of Russian election interference that actually, it turns out, was actually much smaller scale than surmised. But on the day of Trump's inauguration, there was a lot of discussion. Hillary Clinton called the election result illegitimate and said that it was partly the product of Russian election interference. Whatever that was, that pales in comparison,
really
to the effect of the systematic suppression on domestic soil of a story that 2 years later, every news outlet in this country has absolutely admitted was indeed true when it was systematically suppressed at the time. So you asked the question, is there any basis? There's your basis.
And it is, do you have an opinion as to, is it the explicit pictures of Hunter that would have in some way changed people's minds, or the as of yet unproven claims that Joe Biden is involved in some kind of bribery fraud scheme, or like what about it?
So I'm not speaking for the survey respondents, but I can tell you what speaks to me.
Yeah.
Actually, because I wouldn't have changed my vote. I voted for Trump, right? So I wasn't one of the survey respondents who said I would have changed my vote because of it.
Good.
So here's what does speak to me, and I think it's relevant. Let's just take this outside the scope of political partisanship. The Burisma payments to Hunter Biden are a deep problem. $5 million paid by a Ukrainian company, privately owned by somebody who at the time was sitting on the National Security Council in Ukraine. Relevant now because it did result in an impeachment of a US president who called, that was Trump, who called for further investigation of that in Ukraine. But that wasn't the only geopolitical consequence of it. I think it has deep-seated implications even now for, say what many people on Russia's side of this say. Well, you have a US president whose son was dealing, when that person was vice president, with actually the Ukrainian government indirectly, accepting what in any other context we would call bribes. So much so that President Obama's staff actually raised this with Biden, only to be shouted down by it. This is a bipartisan concern. That's a real issue. Also, the shell companies created to do business with China and the Chinese government, again, paid millions of dollars. That is relevant information on the eve of a presidential election, when the fourth largest newspaper in circulation, the New York Post, founded by Alexander Hamilton, had its social media accounts locked for publishing a story where you and I would have had our accounts locked for even sending it via direct message or email. So I do think we have to go back and reconcile ourselves with that, have to reckon with that, admit what went wrong if we're actually to move forward in the future. sweeping that under the rug and relegating that to be the concern of rubes that live in the middle of the country and are election deniers, I think is the wrong approach for us to heal as a country. I think we have to reckon with the fact that we did that as a nation. The United States of America, we let that happen. Admit that. Now, my view is nations make mistakes. You can move forward if you understand those mistakes, but we have to be open about them.
I'm really enjoying Vivek Ramaswamy at the moment, and I don't know if it's a phase. I'm not sure if this is just a purple patch that he's having before Trump gets good with the law, hits his 2016 form, and then it's game over.
You shouldn't have. What was that? Is that a dog? Uh-oh. It's Hillary.
Or if he could genuinely be a contender. I honestly think that Vivek Ramaswamy versus RFK on a debate stage would be absolutely mouthwatering. But back to the interview, and Vivek handled that very, very well there. He did well to stand his ground because the way that the question was framed was that it was a sanity test. Like, if you have any objections whatsoever, you are insane. If you look at that election and you have any questions at all about the suppression of the laptop, the strange business deals with Ukrainian oligarchs, which now the USA is sending billions of dollars to that country, the manifest unpopularity of Joe Biden, who supposedly polled 81 million votes but can't even get 81 people to a rally, the mail-in ballot system. If you look at any of that whatsoever and you have any questions, you are basically a white supremacist. Pretty unbelievable to think about the whole situation, to be honest. And one of the funny parts is that the same people who will say this will be those that were screaming Russiagate, Russiagate, Russiagate all those years. But I guess that's just politics. It's a sport. They root for their team no matter what, and all ethics just go out the door. Now for a very interesting back and forth about wokeness. Guys, before we get to the next part, if you don't mind, just quickly hitting that like button so that you can tell YouTube, hey, I want more people to see this, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That would be fantastic.
I have to talk to you about woke and wokeness. You wrote the book. It's in the title. One of the things I'm interested in when it comes to the anti-woke movement and woke as a cancer or a problem is that there's about a half dozen or more polls that show that wokeness seems to be the predominant perspective if you look at the whole country. I won't give you the full list, but just so we put a couple here, there's one poll from Pew, which finds that about 6 in 10 Americans say on the issue of going far enough, the right distance or not far enough on making trans people feel okay, not discriminated against, understanding their issues. 60% say we've hit the right note, or we actually have not gone far enough. There's one from The Hill about 60% of the country is against any restrictions on drag performances. This is the sort of thing I'm talking about. Maybe you will dispute the numbers, maybe you won't, but those are some of the data I'm working with. Doesn't it seem as though the anti-woke idea is maybe overplaying a hand that might do well in some parts of the country, but won't win a national campaign, as evidenced by what Ron DeSantis is seeing right now, losing 42% of his support in the primary?
So I want to say something, which I've said before, but it doesn't seem to matter, but I'm going to say it anyway. The media seems to be the one that uses a label of anti-woke to describe my campaign. I am running a campaign to revive national identity. And at the time I wrote Woke Inc.,
yeah,
you know what people criticized the title back then? People said, nobody knows what this word is.
Okay.
So at the time I wrote the book, that was actually the chief criticism of the title. And unlike many on both the left and right, I will define exactly what it is that I view as a symptom of a deeper malaise in our current.
I thought you were going to define woke itself.
No, well, wokeness is a symptom, and I will define the symptom, but it is also a deeper cancer. And wokeness is a worldview that says that there are certain invisible social relationships between us, grounded on oppression or oppressor relationships and statuses of people based on race, gender, and sexuality. That you're either oppressor or oppressed based on those genetic attributes, that there are invisible societal injustices resulting from them, and that we have to be awake, alert to those injustices and then correct for them. Left or right, I think that that's a neutral definition that describes at least what we're talking about here.
I have a different one, which is much simpler, which is simply becoming woke is becoming aware that there are problems in our society bigger than any one person's circumstances. That's how I define it. And I know it's very different from what you're saying.
That's a slightly different definition, and one that is set up for more people to agree with it. But I think that, but I think that that's not. I respectfully, David, that's a definition that on its own does not support the specificity of policies that follow from it. Right, racial quota systems in boardrooms. The fact that a company cannot list on NASDAQ unless it has a certain number of quotas filled by racial minorities or sexual minorities on its board. That is a much more specific instantiation that closely tracks my definition of wokeness than a general definition that there are just vaguely some things wrong in the world that are systems that don't result from individual behavior. Well, okay, that's a big leap to get from there to racial quota systems, especially when actually in that very rule, and I'm just triple clicking on that just to get specific, but it is not an outlier. It is an example of what we see pervasively, where people then came back and said, well, how about veteran status or disability status? To which the government, the SEC and the NASDAQ said no, because that would reduce the desired forms of diversity on that board. So we are talking about very specific instantiations of a culture that we can't just elide in the form of a general neutral definition that there are some unfair systems that we need to correct for them. That's not the essence of the claim that alone would support the range of policies that we see. And so I think we have to owe it to ourselves to at least be specific and get on the table, where I'll give Ibram Kendi at least some credit for being specific when he expressly says the right answer to past discrimination is present discrimination. The right answer to present discrimination is future discrimination. Those are his words, not mine. You have to take people like Ayanna Pressley at their word. We don't want any more black or brown faces that don't want to be a black or brown voice. I know that's a little bit uncomfortable to smoke out, because it makes a lot of my friends on the left uncomfortable, because they don't want to agree with those exact statements, even though they do want to agree with the more neutral definition of wokeness that you provided. But we have to smoke that out, where there are policies that directly track what the leading advocates of this movement have said in their own words. That's not me putting words in anybody else's mouth. And I think we just have to own that up and get that on the table so we can actually have an honest, clean-hearted debate about it.
David has done there exactly what woke people tend to do when talking about this idea. They completely underplay what exactly is going on with the movement and just how sinister the results can be. They just ignore it. And Vivek does well here to articulate that, bringing up the quota hiring systems and the said discrimination, but that's not even a tiny fraction of it. It doesn't even scratch the surface. The obfuscation of fundamental basic truths and reality is what is tearing at the fabric of our society. And it's happening right before our eyes. The difference between a man and a woman, for example, whether or not children are able to make decisions about mutilating their bodies. These are just a few of the more significant ideas. And the argument over these basic truths is a reflection of just how far down the path we are. For me, it has to be either they haven't studied this hard enough and they don't really understand the ideas, or they're just being dishonest. Yes, I get it. For the average person who doesn't really care too much about this and just wants to work their job and be with their family and do their thing, it's not a big deal. Sure, I get it. But he's not an average person in this sense, because this is what he does full time, is he observes culture and politics. And it's not that difficult to look at these ideas and look at the intellectual roots of these ideas and pretty much draw a straight line through history and look at some of the historical parallels and understand that it goes far beyond just not being mean. So that's why I much prefer Vivek's approach here, an honest, open, and clean-hearted debate where we can actually smoke out the real issues and get to the nucleus of the things that people are really worried about. Your more simple definition just really doesn't help anything, and to me it seems like just gaslighting, if I'm honest. Now for Vivek to finish this in a very strong way and present a reasonable yet very uncomfortable objection in a very intelligent way.
Well, before we rock and roll on this, but on just a synthesis of this conversation, I just feel, I'm on a mission to lead not a political party, but a nation. And I will share with you a commitment that I'm willing to make. And I hope that that provides some inspiration to people who disagree with me on many issues like yourself. I think that we all need to do better of smoking out the best argument for the side that we actually disagree with, to contend with that, not with some caricature of it. And so I, for my part, believe that I'm doing that in this campaign. And if you spot an instance where you think I'm not, then get that on the table. But what frustrates me, and it does frustrate me, is that I see a lot of and I know this world, man. Like I came from it, right? I graduated from the top of my class at Harvard. I've been through Yale Law School. I'm working at a hedge fund in New York. Like, let's just get real here. Like, I know you. We haven't met before, but I know you in some sense of the word, okay? Like, you're not unfamiliar to me. And what I see amongst even my peers, right, is a form of laziness. I think I'm saying this out of respect and not an attack, in a constructive way. I saw a little bit of it in the start of this conversation, right? Where you're going to be able to smoke out a version of that which can be caricatured, but these are our fellow citizens. And their concerns come from a deep place where if you can do a better job of articulating and smoking out where that concern comes from, then we have an obligation to do it. And that's what gives me my motivation in this race, where people will say, somebody living 50 miles radius of where I am in central Ohio today and say, well, they say the First Amendment applies to tech companies. They're rubes because they don't know that that only applies to the government. Actually, to double click on that and say, you know what, there's something to that intuition. And it turns out if a private actors doing what the government actually implicitly goaded them to do, then the First Amendment does apply. In every instance, to be able to say that when there's something of value there, don't just sweep that under the rug and reject it, smoke it out, and then let's have that real debate. And with respect to the woke or trans case, I'll do the same. I am doing the same. That's what we got to do.
I'm with you in general. I think 3 times now, you've deliberately blurred very different types of issues. We have a real situation in this country where a whole bunch of people think Trump either won or is currently the president.
Wow. Really well done there. He did a fantastic job of taking the politician mask off a little bit, coming down just a level and getting on that sort of human basis. And he essentially said what you did at the start of the interview was lazy, and it essentially disenfranchises giant swathes of the population, and it really gets us nowhere. And without saying as much, he's saying, I've heard all of your arguments before. I've seen many people just like you. You're not new. You're not interesting. And from my live experience, I can take one look at you and know what you think, which is probably true. And I think you could kind of tell that this was eating away at Vivek a little bit, and that he took his time in raising this until he had thought about the most direct but fair way he could do it that would make a larger point. But I must say, huge respect to David Pakman here for having Vivek on his show. But not only that, he also let him speak. Even though at the end it was quite uncomfortable there, he let him air out his thoughts and didn't just interrupt him. Normally, when the host of the show is getting unwanted feedback, their ego will kick in and they'll just interrupt the person and derail the conversation. And he didn't do that. So all I can do is give him props for that interview, even though I don't really agree with him. So guys, as usual, hit those links in the bio if you want to check me out on all different platforms. If you guys want to watch another video, click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.